Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm going to show you guys how I made the silicone prosthetic for my Lauren Curtis collaboration. Lauren and I wanted to show you two looks, one that is easier as it involves no prosthetics, and then a full-on gory movie-style silicone prosthetic. I love that Lauren was excited to get gory as she's a big fan of horror movies. You can see the application for this on Lauren's channel, and this video is going to go behind the scenes about how I made the silicone prosthetic. I'm going to assume most people watching this don't know much about how the prosthetics are made, so it's going to be more of an informative video about what goes into the process rather than a really detailed tutorial on how to recreate it. For larger prosthetics like this, the first step is getting a life cast of the person. We want the prosthetic to curve under the chin and over the lips so you can't sculpt this flat. I'm sculpting this on a life cast of myself so that we could cut down the time that it would take to do it all, and knowing that our faces are roughly the same shape, so even though I sculpted on my face, a soft silicone prosthetic should be able to fit on Lauren's face as well. So I start sculpting the makeup on my head cast. I have a few different reference photos that I'm copying of real traumatic injuries, and a couple of plastic veneer teeth which are used both in the sculpt and in the finished prosthetic. Once I have a rough idea of the shape that I want, I go in and I start adding detail like the texture of the skin pores and the fatty tissue inside the wounds. My friend Powder came over and helped me with some of the detailing as well. We got a heat gun, like one of the creme brulee guns, which can melt the clay, and we found this really cool to make glossy textures and fatty tissue. Now that the sculpt is done, we're going to work on our molds. So the mold I'm using has two different sides to it. It has a positive side, which is the outline of the face, including the nose, the lips, everything. And then we have a negative side, which has all the detail of our sculpt in it. The reason I can't just use the plaster cast of my head is because there would be no way to open it. By expanding out the sides of the mold with this part that we call a flange, it means that I'm going to be able to open the mold easily, and I'm also going to make this out of a much stronger material than the plaster so that I can use and open this mold hundreds of times without any problems. So the process of getting this positive side of the mold includes having the plaster cast of my head and adding on that clay around the outside. Then I cover this in silicone, so it's kind of confusing because I'm making a mold for my mold. But as soon as that silicone is cured, I remove it, I clean out the clay, and then I pour my mold making material into this. I'm using a material called rigid polyurethane. It's basically a really hard plastic. Once that is set, I have the positive half of my mold. People also call this an altered core because I have altered the way that it looks to add on those flanges and add on keys so that the mold is going to lock back together nicely. Now the next step is taking that clay off my plaster head and putting it onto the mold. So the way that you do that without damaging it too much is called floating off. So this basically means my plaster head has been coated in something that breaks down in water. Once my sculpt has floated off, I'm going to position it onto my molds in two pieces. I've separated the gums from the cheeks so that the cheeks can flap around a bit more and look a bit more disgusting. The sculpt will be a little bit damaged from this process, so I'm just going to go and repair any places that need it and retexture any places that have lost detail. The mold making process is quite labor intensive, so I'm sure a lot of people will be like, why would you even bother doing that? The reason being is through this process you get something which looks the most realistic and feels the most like flesh, which you simply cannot achieve doing it all out of kit without using any molds. Using the clay, I can sculpt every single pore texture, every single like fatty tissue, every shred of skin. And once that mold is finished, I can rerun it 100 times. Filling it might only take me an hour or two, and then I have a piece which is really fast to apply. If I was trying to make this out of, like latex and toilet paper or something, not only would it not look realistic, it would be quite rigid, it wouldn't move with the skin, it wouldn't feel like skin, it wouldn't look like skin, and it's way more uncomfortable to wear. So the reason they do it this way for movies is that the application time can be cut way down. The prosthetic's already finished, it's already pre-painted and colored, you're not trying to create it all from scratch, and when they're doing this for films, they need the makeup to look the exact same every single day of shooting for continuity. So if you have a mold, it will always come out the exact same way each time. And now to make the negative half of our mold, I'm going to put a wall up around everything so that our liquid mold making material doesn't pour all over my table. And I've also released our positive side of the mold so that the resin doesn't bond to itself when we pour it on top. And then I pour in that same mold making material, the resin, which is a rigid polyurethane. And once that has cured, we can take the two halves of our mold apart and we clean out the clay that was on the inside. This process can take a while, but then once that is clean, we can run the molds and the silicone will go into every area that the clay was so that what was clay will then become our silicone prosthetic. So with my molds, I put a layer of release down so that it's easier to get our material out of the mold afterwards. I put down a layer of cap plastic which will coat the silicone. The cap plastic helps when you're applying the silicone to have the silicone blend into the skin a bit better. And then I pour my silicone into the mold, and then I put that positive half into the mold to squeeze the silicone in between the two sides. To get really nice thin edges, I also put 2 clamps over this mold. For the chin mold, I did it a little bit differently. I hand painted in a white layer of silicone first to replicate that chin bone, and then I poured in a gum pink layer of silicone, and then again squeezed the 2 halves of the mold together and put a clamp over it. Once that silicone has cured, it takes about half an hour. It will no longer be a gel or a liquid, and I can open up my molds and take that silicone prosthetic out. I decided to pre-paint these as well, just so that application would be a little bit faster. So I put a layer of pink, kind of like a muscly pink, over some parts of the prosthetic, and then I also painted on a layer of blood red. And that is how I made my silicone prosthetics. It seems really daunting and confusing when you first get into it. It is like learning a different language. But once you've done it a few times, it becomes second nature. And I honestly cannot imagine not being able to use molds anymore. Sculpting and making really soft, really realistic prosthetics is one of my favorite things to do. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this was interesting. If you want to know any more about FX makeup, feel free to check out other videos on my channel. And if you're not already subscribed, you can subscribe here. And I'll be back with more Halloween videos soon.